Hey there, all you wonderful people in the digital world. Welcome back once again to another episode of Spliced In Later, where it's time for another ranking. We're ranking some stuff. We haven't ranked some stuff in a while here on Spliced In Later. I'm not sure why. I think just because life gets away from you. Back in the beginning, in the old days of Spliced In Later, when we launched this during a wonderful thing called a pandemic, we did these quite frequently because I was just desperate for content and for stuff to talk about that covered a wide variety of things instead of just speaking about one specific thing over and over again, I suppose. And we used to mix it up. So we do top 10 for a certain year, and then we'll do top 10 of a different genre. For the yearly rankings, I think we're all the way back to 2010 by now, so we're working backwards. And for certain specific things, we've ranked the MCU movies, DC movies, Quentin Tarantino movies, Pokemon movies, a variety of stuff. But yeah, it doesn't happen very often on this show now. I think that's for the best. You know, we're in a time now where I have a lot more that's going on that I talk about, so it's not as frequent. They get spread apart a bit more with all the movies I can finally review now, whether they're in the theaters or on streaming or whatever. And then just the other regular stuff we've got going on. You know, we talk about the MCU quite a lot. I recently went through all the Christopher Nolan movies. I did some countdown for James Bond. There's all sorts of stuff. So I thought, since we're in a bit of a lull between movies that I want to see, I'm sure there's movies that I could see, but I don't want to. I thought, let's do a ranking. What can we do? And then I thought about how excited I am to get Season 3 of Star Trek Picard on DVD for my collection. And every time I look at that, I think it's just insane how much I hate that show, except for that one specific thing. In fact, I've done a whole episode on Star Trek Picard. If you want to listen to that, go for it. Especially because I won't be going too deep into Star Trek Picard or any of the things that we'll be ranking. So that's the only one that gets a little bit of extra if you're curious moving forward. But I thought, I like Star Trek. At the moment, we're just coming out of Season 2 of Strange New Worlds. I'm just currently watching the animated show Lower Decks. It's one of those comfort feel-good shows that have a different variations. So some upsides, some downsides. But a show that generally makes me feel good sometimes. So I thought, let's rank that. Now, I have, in fact, luckily, because we do top 10s, I have seen 10 specific Star Trek shows. I haven't seen every single Star Trek show, but I've seen 10. So we can fit them into our ranking here. But this one's going to be a little special then, in that most of the others are always top 10. So I normally only have positive things to say about what I'm ranking on here. Even Quentin Tarantino, I only ranked 8 of his stuff because I haven't seen all 9 of his films, but I love every single Tarantino film. So it was essentially just a top 10. With this, though, ranking the Star Trek shows, in case you haven't figured it out by now, we are ranking Star Trek TV shows, specifically the different variations of Star Trek, the original series, Deep Space Nine, Discovery, whatever's currently out there at the moment. So 10 of them will be in this ranking. But I don't love all 10 of them. In fact, I think are about only maybe more than half I genuinely really love. There'll be a lot more issues, some positives and negatives, and there's some stuff right down towards the bottom that I just don't like, which will be unique for a ranking. In this case, it is a ranking Star Trek shows from worst to best rather than just top 10. So that's a unique experience. The summary of the whole thing, though, in case you do want to know, is that Star Trek is very accessible to all sorts of people for all different reasons. So unpacking this list before we go in, ground rules, all of that stuff. As I said, I haven't seen every single Star Trek show. Specifically, I've not seen Star Trek Prodigy. Not because I think it's bad or I'm above it or anything like that. And I do intend to watch Star Trek Prodigy in the near future for a very specific reason. But originally, when it was announced as this animated show bringing back Kate Mulgrew to voice a version of Captain Janeway, but mostly some animated misfits. But it's a show designed for a younger audience, for children. Meaning, I'm not the target audience for that. And if I go to that and I'm like, oh, this isn't Star Trek. This isn't your gothic horror nightmare from the original series or thinking man show from Next Generation. No shit, of course it's not. So that's the only reason why I didn't really watch it. It's like, it's not really designed for me. I don't think I'll have a good time watching it. I won't have a bad time. It's just really not something designed for me. So I think I can just let it fall to the wayside. But now we exist in a world where shows are defined by tax purposes and greedy fat cats who run their corporations like money scheme, evil queen bastard people. Meaning a poor show like Star Trek Prodigy, who has a relatively successful first season on Paramount Plus, I believe it is, not only has been cancelled while a season 2 has already been made, meaning you can't see that season 2 unless the people that made Prodigy can find somewhere else to distribute it. But due to tax write-off purposes, they yank season 1 from Paramount Plus. So not only can you not watch what has been made but not yet released, you can't even watch what has been released. It just disappears into the ether. Which really makes me mad. I've discussed this before about the necessity of the preservation of media. We don't want to go back to a time where when film is so valuable that the powers that be are like, just tape over those old Doctor Who episodes with something else, because we don't need that anymore. We already showed it. It's fine. We don't ever need it again. We're at that point now where, people's products are heading in that direction again. And for something like Star Trek Prodigy, which is for children, like, come on, man, makes me mad. So when I can, even if it's not really for me, I'm going to try and buy Star Trek Prodigy on DVD. I hope I can. I hope here in Australia it gets released. I will watch it, and I'll probably give it a lot more slack because of the crap that has been put through. Poor old Star Trek Prodigy. But yeah, so that's the only reason why that's not on the list. Meaning, if Star Trek Prodigy is your favorite thing ever and you think it's the best Star Trek show and I don't rank it, that's why. And the other thing, of course, is that everybody's opinions are different. We are all going to have different thoughts and beliefs about what we want out of a Star Trek show, what satisfied our itch, and what doesn't. I've always walked the middle ground for Star Trek. When it's good, it's really, really, really good. Sometimes it's so bad it's entertaining, but I often cut shows a lot of slack. It's very rare for me to be annoyed or poo-pooey on a show or anything like that. Often I will stick with a show even if I hate it, but if it becomes a point where watching a show for me is a chore, that's when it's like, okay, maybe I don't actually like this. So my opinions aren't going to be the same as everybody else's. I guarantee my number one probably is going to be like, what, that one? You have to pick this one because everyone picks this one. And there may be people who are like, that's at your bottom, but that's the first good thing that's ever come out of Star Trek ever. So as long as we're all just kind and civil and nice to each other and understand that, you know, we're different people with different tastes, that is essentially what taste is, I think we can get by relatively unscathed. So on that end, we are going into Spliced In Later's top 10 Star Trek shows, or the shows that Spliced In Later has seen ranked from worst to best. And we'll try not to dawdle too much talking about them because I do not want this episode to be the longest thing in the world. But we'll see how we go. Anyway, let's get started. So coming in at number 10 is Star Trek, the Animated Series. The Animated Series is a very short-lived piece of Star Trek that aired, I believe, late 60s, early 70s, maybe somewhere in the middle of the 70s. It's in that middle spot between when the original series was unceremoniously cancelled after 3 seasons and before its eventual revival with the original series movies, starting with the motion picture. And then the original Wrath of Khan, Search of Spock, all of that, blah, blah, blah. It is very old style animation, very Saturday morning cartoon style animation. But it is essentially the same idea and show that the original series was, just condensed down from a 45-minute episode to a 22-minute episode of sorts. Surprisingly, still retains much of the original cast. William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, James Doohan, they're all back to voice their characters. The episodes, the shows, the adventures that they go on are essentially the same sort of thing, just condensed, meaning it's very hit the ground running from when the show starts, but nothing too extreme or intense. It's on a very small budget. Probably most of the money's going into the voice acting, meaning there's a lot of recycled stories, a lot of recycled animation. You do see the same sort of thing happening over and over again. I believe there's about 20 or so episodes. Not particularly incredible, but the only reason it's on the bottom of the list for me is in terms of rewatchability. You have to really, really love Star Trek, I think, to want to watch the animated series and to enjoy it, I think. Now, I love Star Trek, but I struggle with it too. I think if you pulled an animated episode out and you watched it, and then you didn't watch another one for 4 months, you'd probably get a kick out of it. Every time I rewatch it, I'm always like, oh, this is quite charming. But after 22 episodes of essentially the same sort of stuff happening over and over again, seeing the same sort of animation style, the same animated Kirk doing something but just in a different background, it does start to wear a bit thin for me. Again, yeah, it's a testament to its time. Obviously, animation was not up to a particular standard by this point. Working out how to tell stories in animation, what you can and cannot do, meaning it's not really that fair to hold it to the same regard as all the other Star Trek shows on this list. But it would also be absolutely insane to be like, oh, but it's better than some of the others because I just don't like those shows sort of things. No. It served its purpose, which is to keep Star Trek out of the oblivion that is cancellation, to keep it in the public mind, to let the people behind Star Trek's cancellation or whatever know that there is still an audience for it and an enthusiasm for it. And I think its existence did help keep Star Trek alive, whether it was working on that never premiered Phase 2 show or what eventually would become the motion picture. The actors voicing the characters are putting all their effort into it. It does sound like they're reading their lines from a script, but they're not monotonous. Leonard Nimoy still sounds like Spock. William Shatner's putting in his Shatnerous stuff as Captain Kirk. And some of the stories are insane in a way that only an animated show can do. Probably something that Star Trek could not do in its original run because of limitations for sets and human beings and that sort of stuff. So yeah, not that much to really say about the show. It's charming, it's quaint, but it's a slog to watch, especially if you're trying to rewatch it all in one go. I understand its purpose. I understand looking on it with nostalgia glasses. But at the end of the day, if I'm rewatching all of Star Trek and I get to the animated series, it does for me feel like homework. Something that I have to do if I am watching all of Star Trek, if I want to get between original series and original movies. So there you go. That's why it's at the bottom of the list. For number 9, it was a hard run trying to figure out which was going to get number 9. But in the end, I went with Star Trek Picard. As much as I love season 3 of this show and think that it is one of the best seasons of any show and a fantastic continuation for the next generation, something that gets Star Trek right that hasn't been done in a lot of iterations of the show in the modern era, that doesn't excuse that the first 2 seasons of the show I cannot stand. I do not like. I don't want to rewatch. I don't like that it exists. I don't like what it does to the concept of Picard himself. So it has to come down there. You cannot say something is good just for one very specific thing when overwhelmingly the rest of it is garbage. Star Trek Picard, I went into a lot more detail in that episode where I talked about the bafflingness of how a show can be so bad and then so good. It is a continuation for the character of Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the Enterprise from the Next Generation, played by Patrick Stewart. In this iteration, he's a much more older, jaded, miserable sort of character. The idea, I suppose, was to strip him back, understand what makes Picard as a character. Kind of like how Smallville's the idea is to have no tights, no flights. With this, it's no Enterprise, no familiar crew, no make it so, no uniforms. It's Picard dealing with supposedly very personal issues, whether it's his leftover relationship with Data or his long found distance from his father and his unknown relationship with his mother, the people he has harmed in his life or has manipulated, or connection with the Romulans or the Borg. I love the Borg on this show. But Picard essentially just became the current problems show, which is another reason why Picard struggled. Star Trek, as a concept, is escapist TV. It is sometimes very thought-provoking. It does some great stuff with science fiction and fantasy and comedy and all of that. But for the most part, people want to watch Star Trek because they just want to go on a very self-contained weekly episode with your favorite Star Trek crew, have some fun, maybe think about what you've seen, maybe be moved, and then move on. And at the end of the day, it is also supposed to be a shining beacon of hopes for humanity. When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, it was because in the future, he wanted humanity to be all united, no wars, no poverty, no need for money, in a 60s way. Still a little bit sexist, still a little bit racist, but the majority of the ideas being that by the time humanity ventures off into space to visit new worlds, we as a society don't have problems anymore. Yes, it makes it a little bit difficult to write good stories, especially today when you have that sort of shackle. But for the most part, it's still a sort of warm, shining light at what humanity can be. What Picard did then was the people making it in the beginning were looking at the current problems of today, global warming, politics problems, racism, all of that, and just went, it's still happening in Picard times. So we're going to comment on how terrible life is now by showing it in the concept of Star Trek and how terrible it is there. Which is just depressing, because it's like, if we can't get to the 32nd century without there still being global warming and without there still being political pricks in power and poverty and homelessness and all of that terrible stuff, it just makes for miserable viewing. Add to that, you had unlikable characters and batshit writing, which just sort of didn't know what it was doing for those first 2 seasons until it became essentially like, we have to stop the big thing opening in space with the space laser. There's giant robot flowers coming out to eat us all. Over the top, cartoony, supervillain-like characters. Picard wanted to be an action hero, I guess. It just robbed everything that made Picard such a great character and Star Trek such a great world to visit. By the time we got to 3, new showrunners, I've gone hugely in depth to why season 3 of Star Trek Picard is so good, so go check out that episode if you want. But one good season does not a good show make, so that's why it's down here at number 9. I think if I ever rewatch Star Trek Picard, it'll be begrudgingly so I can watch season 3. Coming in at number 8 is Star Trek Discovery. This was the one that fought hard with Picard to be at the bottom when you discount the animated series. Star Trek Discovery was originally the flagship for new Star Trek on CBS All Access, which eventually became Paramount Plus. The idea of relaunching the Star Trek IP with brand new shows. It was mostly a failure, I think, especially with the way Picard went as well. We now have a new show, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is being much more successful at that, meaning Discovery has a season 5 out there somewhere to finish it, but who knows when we're going to get it. Discovery is the show that wanted to be anything but Star Trek. It wanted to be action, it wanted to be entertainment, it wanted to be Star Wars, but it didn't really want to be Star Trek. Meaning, from the get-go, it alienated a lot of diehard Star Trek fans, but then it couldn't really bring in brand new fans because it was still like, what's all this stuff? What are you referencing? What's Spock? What's Vulcans? I don't care. What's happening? Discovery has come in waves for me. I've never really stuck with it because it's always embraced something that doesn't work for Star Trek, which is season-long arcs. Star Trek works great with episodic storytelling where you focus on character development and different horrors of the week or whatever that you can absorb and go, and move on. With Discovery, it's like season 1 is the Klingon War and the Mirror Universe and Michael Burnham, who is our main character on this show's fall from grace and then rise to captain or whatever, I don't care. Then season 2 is mysterious Red Angel and things that appear at different parts of the galaxy. It got better by season 3, where it just pulled it back from the problem of it being a prequel Star Trek show and the canon breakingness of it that it was. Threw the crew 900 years into the future, brand new Star Trek to explore. But in the end, it was still lacking, I think. The Starfleet and the Federation at the end of this galaxy was still miserable and boring, and we were still doing this thing that opens up, causes destruction, goes somewhere else. We're chasing along after it, trying to do this thing. Add for that such a focus on the character of Michael Burnham, meaning you have all these other characters hanging around, but no one really knows what to do with them. The shining beacon for Discovery will always be Doug Jones as Saru, a very interesting alien character who really threw himself into becoming that alien character. But one character amongst a sea of just forgettableness, I think. And that's what Discovery really was. It was a lot of characters would stand around crying because they're so emotional, and you're just like, why are you crying? I don't understand. Am I supposed to be feeling something? Don't really get it. There was a time where Discovery seemed to be it for Star Trek, but luckily we're in a different age now. Bits of it I like, but again, I don't look forward to it. I don't like to rewatch it, so it's at number 8. At number 7 is Star Trek Voyager. Voyager is an example of such a great concept in the beginning that eventually just gets wasted over time. A show that starts off really strong on right foot forward, and then by the end is just like, okay. It's a great concept. Star Trek Voyager follows the crew of the Voyager, played by captained by Captain Catherine Janeway, Kate Mulgrew, the first female captain in Star Trek. The Voyager is accidentally hurled across the galaxy to the Delta Quadrant, which is so fucking far away from Earth and the Federation that it's going to take them, who knows, like 9 billion years to get back home. So the crew are originally chasing space pirates or space terrorists, the Maquis. Those two crews have to sort of come together and form their own crew. They have to use their wits to figure out how they can get back home faster, to avoid alien races that Star Trek has never seen before, and try and not kill each other along the way. That sounds awesome. That sounds like a great show, and it is a great concept at the start. But they sidestep it by saying that, the Maquis are just Starfleet officers that went rogue, so they can just be Starfleet again. And then it just became still the same sort of Star Trek stuff. You know, we did the same species over and over again, the same things they have to come across. Very weak characters as well. A lot of the crew are forgettable. Chakotay, Tom Paris, Harry Kim, don't care about them. And I think the show knew that, which is why towards the end, not only did they introduce a really cool character in the Borg 7 of 9, but it became the 7 of 9 show. It was very much, we got to focus on these specific characters because they're the only ones that are actually good and that we've developed, you know, our 7 of 9. Our hologram doctor that starts off as this grumpy piece of shit, but then not only becomes a really, really engaging character, but strives for some sort of sentient life, being a hologram that can leave sickbay, that can go on away missions, that wants to be seen as an actual life form. By the end of it, you know, it's sort of the same stuff. They would have moments where things would ramp up and it would be interesting. But it really, for me, it never really lived up to the hype that I was excited for when I started it. When it's like, this is going to be cool. And then it was just like, it's fine, I guess. Just not that particularly interested. But still, the gap between Discovery and Voyager is tremendous. I should say that. Voyager is still a good show. Still has the ideals of Star Trek. Still knows how to be Star Trek. So I would need that cleared up before anyone gets confused by that. In terms of the good Star Trek, I should say, Voyager's at the bottom for me. Where are we at? Coming in at number 6? Yes, coming in at number 6 is Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is the current Star Trek iteration. If you'd asked me to make this list a little bit earlier, I think Strange New Worlds would have been higher. But Season 2 just ended for me, and there were a lot of sort of take 'em and leave 'em episodes for this season. A lot of retreading the same sort of stuff over and over again. A little worrying that it could go the Discovery route, but I don't think so. I think it's doing okay. And it landed on a particularly strong season finale cliffhanger for me, so we'll be alright. Strange New Worlds takes the one good thing that came out of Discovery, which is Anson Mount's portrayal of Captain Christopher Pike, who was a very iconic Star Trek character from way back with the original failed pilot episodes of Star Trek back in the 60s. Pike was essentially the figure of Star Trek before Kirk. So it's sort of his adventures. It's him on the Enterprise before the adventures of Kirk and friends. You've got your Spock. There's a young Uhura, a young Nurse Chapel. Dr. M'Benga was on the show for a bit. He's chief medical officer here. Number One, another leftover character from that pilot that never picked up. We get hints at the future of Star Trek. Kirk eventually does show up on the show. Scotty eventually there as well. But it manages to combine the sort of newness of Discovery with the way characters talk and act and the emotion and everything it wants to be, but then also does the episodic nature that we all love from Star Trek. Each episode is normally about a specific character, whether it's Pike, Spock, Number One, Nurse Chapel, anything like that. And then they have them go through specific quintessential Star Trek stuff. That first season of Strange New Worlds was so good and so refreshing, I think. But season 2 fell short for me because season 3 of Picard came out in the middle of that. And season 3 of Picard showed what Star Trek could be. Strange New Worlds is a step in the right direction, still has its faults. But unlike Discovery, because of the development of its main crew, of its cast, it's a lot more successful in that. I like every single character on Strange New Worlds. I like their relationships. I like where they're going with the show. I do think sometimes the episodes are a bit too preachy, a bit too messy, but then they'll do stuff that they've never done before. They did a crossover with Lower Decks, an animated show, and they made it work. They did a musical episode, and they made it work. They did a trial episode, which we've seen a million times in Star Trek before, but it worked. Even Spock, played by Ethan Peck, I did not like him in Discovery. He's very slowly warming up to him. He's no Leonard Nimoy, but he's doing his best. I think if I wanted somebody to understand what Star Trek is in a live action sense, and I had a choice between the new shows that are currently on or have been, I would say Strange New Worlds 100% is what you should watch if you need to understand what is entertaining about Star Trek and why you should watch Star Trek. I wish it were higher, but still at number 6, it's pretty good. At number 5 is Star Trek Enterprise. This might be too high for Starheads. Oh, that's probably the correct word for it. For Trekkies, for diehard Star Trek fans, because Enterprise is seen as the show that killed Star Trek for a bit. Once Next Generation launched in the late 80s, it was followed immediately by Deep Space Nine, by Voyager, by Enterprise. You had essentially non-stop Star Trek programming for a long time. Enterprise comes along, only lasts 4 seasons, gets cancelled, and people are like, oh yeah, because it was a bad show and it killed Star Trek, which I think isn't further from the case. I really like Enterprise because it takes the core concept of Star Trek, strips it back, and shows it's essentially the origin of Starfleet, the origin of Federation. It's the adventures of Scott Bakula as Captain Archer, and he's essentially the first Enterprise, the crew that first go into space. This is before a Federation, so it's just Starfleet. It's just mainly a human crew. The humans essentially are floundering in space, trying to go further than they've ever gone before. Too fast, in my opinion. The Vulcans are there to critique them at every step. Archer is a great captain. You've got a Vulcan on the crew, T'Pol, who just does not want to be there. And a unique, interesting some characters. There are some that are sort of thrown to the wayside. Your Mayweathers, your Satos. But you've got Trip Tucker, who everybody loves. You've got Malcolm Reed, who everybody loves. Dr. Phlox, who's a lot of fun. But I think it's just Enterprise was new without being new, if that makes sense. It was doing the origins of Star Trek, so you see your Klingons, your Andorians, all of that stuff, but it was casting it in a different light. And yes, you could be like, oh, that doesn't track with what happened in a different Star Trek or whatever. But who really cares? Never hold a show to a very specific set of rules canon-wise, because you really box yourself in with your ability to tell stories, I think. Enterprise was also the first season-long arc with the hunt for the Xindi, this alien race that came down, obliterated the Earth, and then ran away, and Enterprise went after them for revenge. It's like a season-long arc, and it was engaging because it was tense, it was atmospheric. It still managed to do some Star Trek-y stuff along the way, but it managed to tell a season-long arc in a way that Discovery has never been able to. It might be personal bias. Enterprise might not be as visually astounding as Strange New Worlds or as classic Star Trek-y as Voyager, but I really like it. I enjoy it a lot. I get a lot out of that concept, out of that crew. And apart from its finale, which is trash because it was just a Next Generation episode with featuring the Enterprise characters, I think it's really good. And I really think a lot of people, if you've cast it aside or don't consider it because of its reputation or because of its only 4 seasons compared to the 7 seasons of the other big Star Trek shows, I reckon give it another chance, rewatch it, because there's some good stuff, and that's why I love it at number 5. Coming in at number 4 is Star Trek Lower Decks, another animated show, and a show that I've only really just started watching this year. When Lower Decks was announced, I watched a trailer for it. I hated it. It looked like Star Trek as Rick and Morty. I don't hate Rick and Morty. I don't love Rick and Morty, but I understand the appeal for Rick and Morty. Maybe one day I'll like it, but for now, the few episodes that my friends have shown me, I think are fine, but I just don't care. But the Rick and Morty style humor, I originally thought does not work for Star Trek. Give me your very serious military officers in serious situations. Don't give me them going, my fucking leg, you cut my leg off, you dickhead, swearing and all of that shit. Doesn't really seem Star Trek-y to me. So I was like, fuck it. Very oppositely to my opinion of Star Trek Prodigy, where Prodigy's like, it's not for me, but I understand. Lower Decks, I was like, that's just stupid. That's them going, look, it's Star Trek, but adult animation. I was like, whatever. But then I found out that Strange New Worlds was doing a crossover with Lower Decks, and that Lower Decks characters were going to appear on Strange New Worlds. And because I'm obsessive, compulsive freak, I was like, well, I don't want to watch that episode and not understand who these characters are. So I watched all of Lower Decks to understand that episode. And by the end of the 3-season binge, and currently I'm watching the 4th season as it's premiering right now, I was like, I was completely wrong about this show. Yes, it is Rick and Morty style humor. It's very adult. It's very silly. It's very wacky. It's very sweary and gory and all of that. But the people making it clearly love Star Trek, have a deep well knowledge of understanding of the show, and as such, even though it's a adult silly style show, the episodes, the adventures, the characters still feel Star Trek, and it is some of the best Star Trek storytelling that I've seen. The characters, basically, it's not really about a specific captain and their crew, even though the captain and the crew is a part of the show, but our main characters are the Lower Decks, the ensigns, the cogs that work at the bottom of the show, doing the mundane tasks and getting all the risks and none of the reward of sorts. That's how it starts out. Eventually, it does become like a big whole ship-style show where the Lower Decks and the higher officers are all relying on each other. But originally, it's like, the big terrible things are what's happening in the background, and they're like, I've got to change the adapter before the chip explodes, but no one cares, and I've got to go play bingo later. The Cerritos as well is not a flagship ship. It's not your Enterprise, your Voyager. It's not importantly based like Deep Space Nine. So Starfleet doesn't really care about it, but it still has to go through Star Trek style horror situations. The main characters, Beckett Mariner and Brad Boimler. I really love them as characters, and I love their relationship, which at the moment, unless the show changes, is very just brother-sister style relationship. It's not a forced romance of sorts. They're constantly picking on each other, belittling each other, putting each other down, but also building each other up in a way that really works. And then the wacky characters, Tendi and Rutherford, the other ensigns, or Captain Freeman, or Commander Ransom, they're all great in a silly, wacky sort of way, but they've all really grown on me. And the show is just constantly pulling on concepts or Easter eggs or references to the whole catalog of Star Trek stuff. Original series, Next Generation, Deep Space, Voyager, Enterprise, Strange New Worlds. The people who are making this clearly know every single inch of Star Trek lore and understand it in a way that I think the people making Discovery or those first 2 seasons of Picard did not. Meaning, if you know everything about Star Trek, you're going to have a ball with every episode because you'll understand what's happening. You will see the references, but you can also enjoy it and not have any clue what they're talking about because they make their own stories and adventures out of this stuff. I cannot praise Lower Decks enough. I would rank it higher, but I think at the moment I'm just coming off how much I'm enjoying it at the moment. And as great as it is, there are always sometimes some episodes where I'm like, yeah, okay, take it or leave it. But I'm really loving it. I'm really surprised at how much I like it and how much it works as a Star Trek show. So, taking the foot out of my mouth, I have to say, here's Star Trek Lower Decks at number 4. At number 3 is Star Trek, the original series, the free season 1960s show with William Shatner as Captain Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock, DeForest Kelley as Dr. McCoy, and others. This is the show that started it all right from the get-go. You know it's something special. It's an intriguing sci-fi show that's also kind of like a horror show, a Twilight show. A lot of times the Enterprise, on a 5-year mission to explore reaches of space that have never been explored before, are thrown into horrific nightmare scenarios, which mean the crew desperately have to find a way to survive and yet maintain their cool. It's a very, very endearing show that I think anyone can watch. It's not dated, except obviously for the datedness of the sets. Yes, sometimes the aliens are just big cardboard blobs or weird puppets on strings. But it's charming in a way that the animated series isn't because it's live action. What makes it so rewatchable is the concept of the Federation, of the Klingons, of the aliens, all of that stuff, but mainly just the main 3 characters, your Kirk, Spock, and Bones. The trifecta. The Trinity in the way that Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman wish they could be. They play off each other so well. Captain Kirk is the jovial, fun-loving, womanizing captain, played hilariously over the top by William Shatner. Got Leonard Nimoy as the emotionless, logical Mr. Spock, to the exasperation of everyday man Leonard Bones McCoy, who's the doctor of the ship. Often it's the 3 of them caught up in situations. Often it's the 3 of them arguing with each other about how they're going to get out of situations. And their relationship is so endearing and so wonderful that it makes sense why the show essentially was about them. Everyone talks about how the original series has Sulu and Uhura and Chekhov, but they're just there. They're in the background. They're not really fleshed out on a character development. Maybe Scotty, the chief engineer, but that's probably because he's like, oh, look at me, I'm Scottish. That wasn't a very good Scottish accent. Moving on. But the fact that the show survives as well as it is and is entertaining just on these 3 characters is great. I love watching it for them specifically. And you have your iconic episodes, you have your batshit insane episodes, but the concept of Star Trek, of the franchise that would just explode massively into what it is in this very simple weekly horror show with these really great characters, which obviously bled over into the movies, which are probably even better than the show because it builds on this relationship between these 3, has some really great story and is able to develop them in a way that the show never really did because it was built in a way to be accessible to all people. They really didn't want you to tune into Star Trek in the 60s and be like, I don't understand what's going on. They need you to be able to access it the moment you open it. Great stuff. I wish I could rank it higher, but it also shows its age in certain bits. It doesn't work as an ensemble in the way that other shows have. But you can't deny, original series is Star Trek at number 3. At number 2 is Star Trek The Next Generation, which is really what made Star Trek truly successful after the revival of the original series in the movies. The Next Generation is the Picard show, really, in a way that Picard never really was. Patrick Stewart is Captain Picard. Unlike Kirk, he's more refined, he's more calm and self-assured, doesn't like people. The type of captain who will stay on his ship and send out his subordinates to do what needs to be done. He's on his own Enterprise, not necessarily exploring unknown space, but as the flagship has to go around, do a lot of diplomatic stuff, do a lot of rescuing, calming down crises, all of that. Unlike the original series, though, Picard, The Next Generation really is an ensemble show. You've got Commander Riker, the first in command. You've got your Klingon Worf and all his Klingon stories. The android Data trying desperately to be human. blind chief engineer Geordie LaForge, mind-reading counselor Deanna Troi, good old Dr. Beverly Crusher, everyone's hated Wesley Crusher, the young prodigy. Whoopi Goldberg is the bartender. There's a lot going on here. Next Generation made Star Trek accessible to everybody, I think. It launched all the spin-off series. It established the world of Star Trek that I think everybody remembers, you know, all the different species, the way Starfleet operates, the big moments in Starfleet history. It's all here on the Next Generation. It is the most accessible show, I think. Again, it's a show that you can access on a weekly basis, but it had its underlying arcs, which were never at the forefront. They were constantly being developed in a way that doesn't detract from the show as a whole, whether it's Data's quest to be more human, or Klingon culture, or the introduction of the Borg with the resistance is futile stuff. It's really good. Like, I love Next Generation. It is probably the best Star Trek show. But in terms of me personally, there's obviously one more that I like a little bit more. Understandably, it got its own set of movies as well, which were not nearly as successful. Next Generation has one of the best season finales of all time. It knew how to end the show. And for a show that had to make 26 episodes every season, that's a lot. It managed to be fresh. There were some duds here and there, but for the most part, it's a solid run for a Star Trek show. I don't really want to talk too much about it because it makes more sense, and I've talked about Next Generation as well a lot in the Star Trek Picard episode. So I guess what I'm saying again is go listen to that episode. So if Star Trek The Next Generation is number 2, that would mean, of course, unless you don't understand anything about Star Trek, in which case it's nice that you're listening to this episode. Number 1 for me is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine was the second spin-off show after Next Generation. Unlike all the other shows, it's not set on a ship that's traversing the galaxy. It's set on a stationary space station that just so happens to be orbiting a wormhole that can open to the Gamma Quadrant, another part of deep space that would be inaccessible to the Alpha Quadrant on regular travel. The space station was originally run by Cardassians, who are terrible aliens that were occupying another planet, Bajor. They pulled back, and now the Federation controls it, and it's given to Captain Benjamin Sisko. Sort of like a Picard, but a lot more jazz-loving, emotional, fun-loving sort of character who has his own sort of tragedy going on there. The space station is run by Starfleet, but also has a lot of wacky different characters that are just living on the space station. Whether it's Ferengi Quark, the bartender who's doing his blackmailing, the constable, chief of security, Odo, who is a changeling, but he doesn't know it. The origin of his species is very unknown to him at that point. Working in conjunction with Bajor, which was built very much to be a militia-style planet to fight off the occupation of Cardassians. But then dealing with the fact that on the other side of that wormhole is the Dominion, a terrible, oppressive sort of system of planets. They want to come through the wormhole and destroy the Federation and take over the galaxy on that end. So not only do you have to deal with the Cardassian bullshit, but you have to deal with horrible, violent creatures coming through that wormhole to destroy the Federation. Apart from it being a very good Star Trek show with the usual Star Trek stuff, apart from having great characters like Sisko and Odo and Chief O'Brien and all of that, what I really love about Deep Space Nine is it firmly marches that thing I love for a TV show where you can have it accessible to everybody. You can have episodes which just exist on their own, but there is an overarching arc, a narrative that takes place from the beginning of the show to the end. In this instance, it is the Dominion War. It is this escalating conflict between the Alpha and the Gamma Quadrant that spills out into all-out war. What starts as like just a space station show with kooky characters turns into a full-on military show. Building these characters, throwing them into situations that change drastically depending on what they're involved in. If it's the Dominion War, if it's the Cardassian occupation, if it's the Bajor prophecy and prophets and all of that stuff as well. The characters evolve, they mature, they go through terrible things, they bond as people, and it really, for me, is the most fun watch for me when I go and watch Star Trek shows from start to finish. It is a very satisfying escalation of storytelling and characters and ideals and all of that stuff that makes Star Trek show great, that builds to a point which has a satisfying, big, bombastic conclusion. In a way that Discovery wanted to be but never was. In a way that Star Trek the original series has never bothered to be. This Deep Space Nine is just great storytelling, great shows, great characters, and quintessentially my favorite Star Trek. Easily, hands down. I'll probably do a whole episode on Deep Space Nine one day, if I ever feel like talking about Star Trek again on this show. It is my favorite. It might be upsetting to some people if, it's like, oh, the Next Generation, that is the best. Or, of course, it's the original series. How could you say anything's the best? But I think there are a lot of people that would agree with me that Deep Space Nine is the best in terms of storytelling. And it's everything about Star Trek come together that works perfectly before drifting off from Voyager downwards, I think. Good stuff. Love Deep Space Nine. It's my number one. There, well, thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this very, very extensive yet also flippant look into Star Trek. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you liked the ranking. As I said, if you disagree, I don't care. Just let me know. Make your own ranking. Let me know what you think is the best Star Trek and the worst Star Trek. Try and keep it civil, but it's the internet, so that probably won't happen. Thank you very much for listening. I will be back next week to review another movie. I won't say what it is because I doubt anyone even knows this movie's coming because no one gives a shit. So I can't wait to talk about it. So be sure to tune in next week for that. But until then, thanks for tuning in for a wonderful Star Trek talk, and I'll see you on the next Spliced In Later. Live long and prosper, friends. Adios, muchachos. I'll catch you next time.